The day Stephen Sullivan decided he was done with love forever, he drove a fence post so deep into the hard Texas earth that his palms bled, and he told himself that was exactly what a broken heart deserved: hard work and nothing else. That had been 4 years ago, in the spring of 1879, when Clara Hutchins had smiled at him across the church social in Calhoun Creek, Texas, taken his hand in hers, whispered promises against his ear in the warm June dark, and then married Jerome Beckett 2 weeks later because Jerome had land and Stephen had only ambition. He had stood at the edge of town and watched the wedding wagon roll past, and something inside him had gone quiet in a way that still had not fully woken up. He was 28 years old now, the owner of a modest but well-kept horse ranch outside of Calhoun Creek, and he had decided that the quiet was fine. The quiet was better, even. Horses did not lie to you. Horses did not smile at you with stars in their eyes and mean something else entirely. His ranch sat on the western edge of town, where the scrub oaks thinned out into open range, and the sunsets came in long, violent streaks of orange and red that would have made a man with a poet's heart weep. Stephen was not a poet. He was broad-shouldered and brown from the sun, with dark hair that needed cutting and green eyes that his mother had once called kind. He kept the ranch house clean enough, cooked his own meals without complaint, rode out at dawn to check on his stock, and spent his evenings on the porch with a cup of strong coffee and the particular satisfaction of a man who has arranged his life so that nobody can hurt him. His neighbor to the north was old Emmett Gaines, who raised chickens and rarely spoke. His neighbor to the south had been the Pryor family, but they had packed up and headed toward California in February, leaving behind a house that sat empty for nearly 3 months while the wind worked its way through the loose window boards and the prairie grass crept up against the porch steps. It was the first week of May in 1883 when the wagon came. Stephen was mending a section of corral fence on the far eastern end of his property when he heard it, the creak and roll of a heavily loaded wagon coming down the trail that cut between his land and the old Pryor place. He straightened up, pushed his hat back on his head, and shielded his eyes against the afternoon light. It was a good-sized wagon, canvas-covered, pulled by 2 bay horses that looked tired but sound. A woman was driving it, sitting straight-backed on the seat with the reins held competently in both hands. Beside her on the bench sat a boy of perhaps 7 or 8, and in the back, visible through the parted canvas, there appeared to be a good deal of furniture and household goods packed with care. Stephen watched as the wagon slowed and turned onto the trail leading to the Pryor house. The woman climbed down before the wagon had fully stopped, landing lightly in the dust, and she stood with her hands on her hips looking at the house with an expression he could not quite read from this distance. Then the boy jumped down and ran ahead to the porch steps, and the woman called something after him that the wind took before it reached Stephen's ears. He told himself it was not his business. He went back to his fence post. He lasted about 10 minutes. It was not curiosity, he told himself as he walked across the stretch of open ground between his fence and the Pryor property line. It was neighborliness. It was the decent thing to do, checking on a woman who had arrived alone with a child and a wagon full of belongings and no man in sight. He was being responsible. He was being a good neighbor. The woman heard him coming when he was still a good 20 feet away. She turned from where she had been examining one of the porch boards, which had indeed gone soft with rot over the winter, and she looked at him directly and without flinching in a way that made him feel, strangely, like he was the one being evaluated. She was somewhere in her late 20s, he guessed, with chestnut hair pinned up but beginning to escape in tendrils around her face from the long day of travel. She was not small. She had a quality of solidity to her, of competence in the way she held herself. Her eyes were a warm brown, sharp and clear, and her face was sun-touched and honest. She was wearing a plain blue dress that had seen better days, and there was dust on her boots and her skirts that told him she had been driving a long time. "Afternoon," Stephen said, stopping at what felt like a respectful distance, turning his hat in his hands. "Name's Stephen Sullivan. I ranched to the south. Wanted to make sure you arrived without trouble. She studied him for a moment as if calculating something. Then she nodded. Letitia Turner, she said. Her voice was even and low, not unfriendly but not eager either. My son is Daniel. We have arrived, as you can see. No trouble to speak of, aside from a loose wheel fitting that my son and I managed ourselves outside of Abilene. You managed it yourselves, he said, and then caught himself because that had come out more surprised than he intended. Something moved across her face, not quite annoyance, but close to it. I have been managing things myself for 2 years, she said evenly. I have had practice. He understood then. Widow. I did not mean any disrespect, he said quickly. She held his gaze for a moment and then the edge went out of her expression, not into warmth exactly, but into something more level. None taken, she said. I appreciate you coming over. It is good to know who your neighbors are. The boy, Daniel, appeared at the doorway of the house and called out, Mama, the back window is broken clean through. There are birds in the kitchen. Letitia Turner turned toward the house with a sigh that she seemed to have collected from somewhere very deep within herself. And then she squared her shoulders and went up the steps with the unhesitating stride of a woman who had learned that problems do not wait for you to be ready for them. Stephen Sullivan stood in the yard for a moment. He could have walked back to his fence. He should have walked back to his fence. I have got extra boards in my barn, he said instead. I can fix that window before dark if you want. She paused on the porch and looked back at him. I cannot pay you right now, she said, and there was nothing ashamed in how she said it, only honest. I did not ask to be paid, he said. Another moment of evaluation. Then briefly something that was almost a smile. Then I thank you, Mr. Sullivan. He fixed the window. He also discovered that the front step had rotted worse than the rest and replaced it with a good plank from his lumber stack. He did not make a production of it. Letitia Turner did not hover or fuss or offer unnecessary conversation. She worked alongside her son unpacking the wagon, and occasionally she handed Stephen a nail when he needed one, or held a board steady without being asked, and they worked in the companionable way of two people who both understand that work is what needs doing. By the time the sun was burning itself out behind the western hills, the window was fixed, the step was replaced, and Letitia had gotten the kitchen functional enough to boil water for coffee. She brought 2 cups out to the porch, handed one to Stephen without ceremony, and stood leaning against the rail looking out at the orange sky. It is a good country, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Where are you from? He asked. Oklahoma Territory originally. My late husband and I were in Missouri for a time. She paused. His name was Robert. He passed 2 years ago from fever. We had a farm, but after he died, the land reverted to his brother under the terms of the loan. Daniel and I have been with my sister in Abilene since then, but she has her own family, and I could not stay forever. I heard there was good land to be had in this part of Texas, land a person could work and eventually own. She said it without self-pity, the way a person recites the practical facts of a situation. Stephen recognized it as courage, the kind that does not announce itself. The Pryor family had this land, he said. They had to sell when they left. Who did you buy it from? A man named Whitfield in town. He said it is good soil for a kitchen garden and maybe some small crops. I also intend to take in laundry and sewing work until I can get something growing. She took a sip of her coffee and looked at him sideways. I am not in the habit of asking for charity, Mr. Sullivan. What I need is time and the chance to work. I understand that, he said, and he did more than she knew. He walked home in the blue dusk with his empty coffee cup still warm in his hand, and he set it on his own porch railing and stood there for a moment looking south at the lights coming on in the old Pryor house, which was the Pryor house no longer. He told himself to keep his distance. He told himself this very firmly, the way he had told himself many things over the last 4 years. He was good at keeping his distance. He had arranged his whole life around the principle of it. In the morning, he found a crate of eggs on his porch that he had not put there, along with a note in a careful, strong hand, for the boards and the window. L. Turner. He stood looking at the crate for a long time. Then he shook his head and went inside to make breakfast. The town of Calhoun Creek in 1883 was the kind of place that had survived long enough to start acquiring ambitions. It had a main street with a proper general store, a blacksmith, a doctor's office, two saloons that the more respectable citizens pretended were only one, a church with a new bell, a schoolhouse, and a post office. It had a sheriff named Dale Morrow, who was competent and fair, and a small but vocal women's sewing circle that was, in fact, the primary governing body of local social opinion. The arrival of Letitia Turner was noted, as all arrivals were noted, by the time she came to the general store on her third day to purchase what she could afford and arrange credit for the rest. Mrs. Caldwell, who ran the store with her husband, was the kind of woman who liked to know everything and liked even more to have known it first, and she got Letitia's story out of her in the pleasant, relentless way of a woman with long practice. By that evening, the town knew that a widow with a young son had taken the old Pryor place, that she was originally from Oklahoma Territory, that she had lost her husband to fever 2 years prior, and that she was honest and self-sufficient and intended to make a go of it. Half the town thought she was admirable. The other half thought she would not last a summer on her own. Stephen heard all of this from his friend Cal Rourke, who was the blacksmith and the best source of news in Calhoun Creek, because everyone came to the blacksmith eventually, and everyone talked while they waited. Cal was a big, red-haired Irishman with a ready laugh and the kind of generous spirit that made people want to tell him things. "She's got grit from what I hear," Cal said, not looking up from the horseshoe he was working. "Bought seed and asked Mrs. Caldwell about the best soil amendments for the South County land. Practical questions. Good ones, too." He paused and gave Stephen a look sideways. "She's your neighbor, you said." "She is," Stephen said, studying his own boots. "Pretty, is she?" "Cal, I am merely asking a geographic question about your neighbor." "No, you are not," Cal grinned. "The widow Turner," he said, with a particular kind of inflection that made Stephen want to leave immediately. "You know, Sullivan, it has been 4 years since—" "I know how long it has been," Stephen said, "and you can stop whatever you are about to say." Cal shrugged with the supreme peacefulness of a man who will finish his thought eventually regardless. "I am just saying that a person can only fence post his feelings into the ground so long before the ground gets full." Stephen said goodbye and rode home. Over the following 2 weeks he kept to himself. He did his work. He looked after his horses. He had 14 now good stock, a reputation for fair dealing and sound animals, and he kept his eyes on his own land and tried not to notice the activity south of his fence line. But she was not easy not to notice. Not because she did anything to draw attention, but because she was simply present in the way of a person who occupies their place without apology. He would see her in the early mornings, already up and working, carrying water from the well, mending the fence along her kitchen garden plot, teaching Daniel to plant seeds in the freshly turned earth. The boy was a good worker, quiet and serious in a way that suggested he had grown up quickly, but he also had a gap-toothed grin that appeared suddenly and completely changed his face, and sometimes Stephen could hear his laughter carry across on the spring wind. It was a Thursday afternoon when the situation presented itself. Stephen was leading one of his young mares back from the far pasture when he heard it, a sharp sound from the direction of the Turner property, the particular crack of something going badly wrong. He tied the mare to the fence and went over at a trot, and what he found was Letitia standing in the yard with her hand pressed against her left forearm, and a broken ladder lying in the dirt, and the shutter of the house's upper window hanging loose from one hinge where it had clearly been caught by a gust of wind. "Are you hurt?" he said, getting to her in 3 long strides. "I am fine," she said. But she was not entirely fine, because her arm had caught the corner of the ladder on the way down, and there was a red wheal rising along the skin just below the elbow. "Let me see," he said, and she held out her arm with the steady practicality of a woman who has been hurt worse, and he examined it. Not broken, A bad bruise and a scrape, but nothing serious. You were going up alone to fix that shutter, he said. The wind would take it completely off tonight if I did not, she said, equally reasonably. You could have asked. She looked at him. There was something proud and careful in her expression, the look of a person who has learned that depending on others is a complicated thing. I try not to make a habit of asking, she said. I know, he said, but I am right here. Something shifted very slightly in her face. So you are, she said after a moment. He fixed the shutter. He stayed for supper because Daniel asked him in that direct way children have that makes refusal seem ungracious, and because Letitia did not rescind the invitation even when she easily could have. She made a pot of beans with salt pork and cornbread, simple food, and they sat at the table in the kitchen and Daniel told Stephen with great enthusiasm about the 3 rabbits he had seen near the creek that morning, describing them in the elaborate detail of a boy who finds everything equally worthy of full reporting. Stephen found that he was smiling more than he had in a while. After Daniel had been put to bed, Letitia poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat on the porch in the warm evening, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the coyotes far out and the crickets close in and the soft shifting of the horses in their corral. How long have you had the ranch? She asked. Since I was 22, he said. Bought it with what I saved from 3 years of trail driving up from San Antonio. It was not much then. I have built it up a little at a time. You drive horses rather than cattle. Mostly. I break and train them and sell them to ranchers and the army ford up near Comanche Creek. Good horses are worth more than good cattle if you train them right, and I have always understood horses better than cattle. She nodded, looking out at the dark. Robert, my husband, he was a farmer, wheat and corn. He was a good farmer. He loved the land the way some people love music, that particular way where the thing you love is just part of how you breathe. She was quiet for a moment. I miss that about him. Not always him as he was in full because grief is complicated and he had his difficulties, but that quality in him, that commitment to a place. Stephen said nothing, letting her have the words. You have that, she said then, surprising him. She turned to look at him, and in the lantern light from inside the window her eyes were thoughtful. I can see it when you are with your horses, that same kind of quiet love for what you do. He did not know what to say to that. Nobody had said something like that to him in a very long time, and it landed somewhere in his chest and sat there warm and a little startling. I suppose I do, he said carefully. She turned back to look at the dark. I am going to make this work, she said, and it was not said to him exactly, more like a promise she was renewing to herself in the presence of a witness. Daniel deserves a real home, a place that is ours that nobody can take. You will make it work, he said, and he meant it because he had watched her these 2 weeks and he knew it for a fact the way he knew a good horse from a weak one. She glanced at him again. This time there was something warmer in it. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Stephen, he said. You could call me Stephen. A small pause. Then quietly, Stephen, good night. The spring deepened into summer, and the thing that Stephen had warned himself against began to happen anyway. The way water finds its way through rock not by force, but by persistence. He told himself it was neighborliness when he came over on Saturday mornings to help with whatever heavy work had accumulated during the week. A post that needed driving, a section of kitchen garden fence that the deer kept pushing through, the beam in the barn that had cracked under the weight of the winter ice they had gotten back in February before Letitia arrived. He told himself it was practical common sense when she began sending Daniel over with extra food on the evenings she cooked more than she needed, because a woman cooking for herself and a child often ends up with more than she intended, and it made no sense for it to go to waste. He told himself many things, and most of them were partly true, which was what made the lying comfortable. Daniel had begun to follow Stephen around on the Saturday mornings in the manner of a boy who has been without a man to study since he was 5 years old, watching the way Stephen handled tools, the way he spoke to the horses, the particular efficiency of movements that come from doing a thing correctly for a long time. Stephen found this attention both touching and slightly alarming. He was careful with it. He did not want to be something to the boy that he was not prepared to be, and yet he could not make himself be cold to a child who had lost his father and was only asking, in the wordless way of children, to be taught things. One Saturday morning in late June, Daniel stood beside Stephen at the corral fence, watching the young chestnut mare move around the enclosure. "She is afraid," Daniel said. Stephen looked at him, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "The way she holds her ears. And she keeps looking at the corner, not at you." Stephen looked back at the mare. The boy was exactly right. "Her last owner was not careful with her," he said. "She learned that some things bring pain, so now she watches for them all the time, even when they are not there." Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking at the horse. "That makes sense," he said, with the gravity of a child who understands something beyond the horse. Stephen looked down at him. "You think so?" "Sometimes I do that too," Daniel said simply, and then climbed down off the fence and went to help his mother carry water. Stephen stood at the fence for a long time after that, and he thought about the mare, and he thought about the boy, and he thought about himself in a way he had been avoiding for 4 years, and the fence post analogy that Cal Rourke had made came back to him with an uncomfortable precision. In July, the matter of Mrs. Hargrove arose. Eleanor Hargrove was the leading member of the sewing circle and the wife of the town's most prosperous merchant, and she had decided, with the confident authority of a woman accustomed to organizing things, that Stephen Sullivan needed a wife. This was not a new opinion. She had been of this opinion for at least 2 years, during which time she had introduced Stephen to no fewer than 4 young women at various church socials and potluck suppers, and he had been polite and distant, and nothing had come of it. What was new was that Eleanor Hargrove had now decided that Letitia Turner was a problem of a particular kind, the kind of independent woman who, by simply existing and managing her own affairs with dignity, made the other women of the town uncomfortable in ways they could not quite articulate. Letitia was polite at church. She participated in the sewing circle when she could, though she was busy enough that she could not always come. She did not gossip, and she did not complain, and she did not ask for help she had not earned. And all of this, combined with the fact that Stephen Sullivan was spending his Saturday mornings on her property, had created a situation that Eleanor Hargrove felt needed addressing. She addressed it by inviting Letitia to tea on a Wednesday afternoon in late July, along with 3 other women from the sewing circle, and conducting a gentle but thorough interrogation dressed up as welcome and fellowship. Letitia told Stephen about it that evening, sitting on her porch, and there was a wry humor in her voice that he had come to appreciate, a private amusement she kept carefully banked, not unkind, but clear-eyed. "She wanted to know if I had any intentions with regard to the bachelor ranchers of the county," Letitia said, turning her coffee cup in her hands. She worded it more elaborately than that, but that was the substance. "Did she name any bachelor ranchers in particular?" Stephen asked, keeping his voice very neutral. Letitia looked at him sideways. "She mentioned the Henderson brothers and a man named Purcell who apparently has a very fine property near the river." She paused. "Your name did not come up." "Ah," he said, but her eyes went to the fence line between our properties twice when she said it, so. "She is not subtle," he said. "She is a woman who runs things," Letitia said without rancor. "I understand that impulse even when it points itself at me. She does genuinely care about the people in this town. She just expresses it like a cattle drive." Stephen laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that surprised him by coming out full and free. Letitia looked at him, and something in her expression shifted, a kind of pleasure at it, carefully kept, but visible to a man paying attention. He was paying attention. He had been paying attention for weeks, and the fact of it kept pressing up against the wall he had built around himself like the chestnut mare pressing against the far side of the corral. In August, there was a dance. The Calhoun Creek Summer Dance was a long-established tradition, a Saturday evening in the old Alderson barn at the edge of town, with fiddle players and a caller and enough food to provision a small army. And everyone came, from the oldest residents to the youngest children. And it was the social event of the summer in the way that such things were in small towns in 1883, which is to say it was the social event of the year and everyone knew it. Stephen had been intending not to go. He went every year because not going would have required an explanation, but he went and stood at the edge of the dancing and talked with Cal and left early, and this had been his pattern for 4 years, and he saw no reason to change it. Cal changed it. "You should ask Mrs. Turner to dance," Cal said, on the evening in question, with the complete authority of a man who believes he is being obvious when he is actually being obnoxious. "I should mind my own business," Stephen said. "You have been minding your own business for 4 years, and the result is that you are standing at the edge of a dance watching other people enjoy themselves." Cal accepted a cup of cider from a passing tray and handed one to Stephen as well. "Sullivan, I say this as a man who cares about you. You look at that woman the way a man looks at something he wants and is scared of in equal parts, and she looks at you the way a woman looks at something she is talking herself out of because she has been hurt before. And I am telling you, if you let this go by out of stubbornness—" "Clara was 4 years ago," Cal said firmly. "And she did not deserve you then, and the fact that she did not deserve you is not a fact about you. It is a fact about her." He gave Stephen a steady look that was, beneath its bluntness, genuinely kind. "Go ask her to dance, you fool." Letitia was standing with Mrs. Caldwell near the refreshment table, and Daniel was somewhere in the crowd with a group of boys his age who had organized some complicated game in the shadows near the barn wall. She was wearing a green dress that Stephen had not seen before, not new but carefully preserved, the kind of dress a woman saves for occasions, and her hair was done up properly, and she had a little color in her cheeks from the warmth of the barn, and the lantern light caught the red in her chestnut hair. He walked over to her with the deliberateness of a man approaching something that might bolt. "Mrs. Turner," he said. She turned from Mrs. Caldwell. "Mr. Sullivan," and then seeing something in his face, "Stephen, would you care to dance?" he said, and he said it plainly, without the performance of it, because he was not a man who performed, and if he had learned nothing else from the last 4 years, it was that performance was not something he had in him anyway. She looked at him for a moment, and he had the sense of watching her make a decision of some weight. Then she handed her cider cup to Mrs. Caldwell, who looked between them with an expression of delighted social significance. "I would," Letitia said. They were not expert dancers, either of them. She was competent, the kind of competence learned at country dances in girlhood, and he was capable enough. And they moved through the reel with the crowd without distinction, which was fine. What was not fine, in the sense of being fine, was the fact of his hand at her waist and her hand in his, and the way she smelled of lavender soap and something clean and honest, and the way she looked up at him once in the middle of the dance, not self-consciously but simply, as if checking that he was still there, and he was. They danced twice. After the second dance, they stood at the edge of the barn door in the warm August dark, and the music came out muffled and sweet behind them, and the stars over Texas were the stars that made men want to speak. "I have not danced in 2 years," she said quietly. "Nor have I," he said. "In 4. She looked at him. There was something in her face that wanted to ask a question, and he supposed she was entitled to it. "There was a woman," he said before she could ask. "Clara, 4 years ago. We were not promised to each other, not officially, but I thought," he stopped. "I thought we were promised in the way that matters more, and then she was not, and I decided I was better suited to my own company." Letitia was quiet for a moment. "And are you," she asked, "better suited to it?" He looked down at her in the dark. "I am beginning to think I was wrong about that," he said carefully. She held his gaze with those clear brown eyes, and the music drifted out behind them, and she said nothing for a long moment, but she did not look away. "Then I am not in the habit of rushing," she said. "I have Daniel to think of, and there is the land, and I am not the girl I was when I married Robert. I am more careful now." "I understand careful," he said. "I imagine you do." She looked out at the darkness, at the stars. "I like talking with you, Stephen. I like," she paused, choosing words with precision. I like who you are when you are being just yourself, without the performance of things. I have never been much for performance, he admitted. No, she said, and this time the almost smile became a real one, brief and bright in the dark, and it hit him somewhere in the chest like a physical thing. I know. The summer burned itself out and fall came in cool and golden across the Texas plains. And something between Stephen Sullivan and Letitia Turner continued to grow in the particular patient way of things that are built rather than seized. He still came on Saturday mornings. Now sometimes she came to the fence on weekday evenings and they talked in the long autumn light, leaning on the rails, while Daniel worked at the kitchen garden or ran along the creek. The conversations deepened the way river water deepens away from shore slowly, and then suddenly you realize you are in something over your head. She told him about her childhood in Oklahoma Territory, about her father who had been a preacher and her mother who had been, in her quiet way, the one who actually held everything together. She told him about meeting Robert at 19, about the first years of the marriage that had been good and full, and about the later years that had been harder, not cruel. Nothing like that. But Robert had his troubles with the whiskey that had come and gone, and the fever that took him had come at the end of a stretch of particularly hard years. And grief is complicated because you grieve not only the person but the life you thought you were going to have. He told her about his own family, parents gone now, a brother in Kansas he wrote to twice a year. He told her about the trail driving years, about the particular education of moving through the country with cattle and men, about the way that life teaches you things a classroom cannot. And he told her about Clara, more fully than he had intended, standing at the fence one evening while the last light turned everything amber, and he was surprised to find that it came out without the old bitterness, just as a fact now, a thing that had happened and formed him. She was not a bad person, he said honestly. She was a practical person who made a practical choice, and I had made the mistake of thinking feeling deeply about something was the same as having it secured. I have tried not to make the same mistake since. Letitia was quiet for a moment. Then, there is a difference, she said carefully, between being careful and being closed. I know, he said. Do you? She asked, not unkindly. He looked at her. The amber light was on her face and she was looking at him with that particular directness of hers that never quite became confrontation but always made him feel seen. I am working on knowing it, he said. October brought a complication. His name was Gerald Fitch, and he was a cattle buyer from San Antonio who had business in Calhoun Creek for 3 weeks while he assessed a large land purchase. And he was handsome in the polished way of men who have money and know it. And he called on Letitia Turner twice, bringing her son candy from the general store and talking to her over the fence with his hat in his hand and his white teeth showing. Stephen watched this from his side of the fence line with an equanimity he did not feel, and he was honest with himself about what he was feeling even if he did not act on it. Because one of the things the last 4 years had taught him was that burying feelings in the ground was not the same as not having them. It was Cal who told him what Letitia had told Mrs. Caldwell, who had told Cal's wife, who had told Cal, that Mr. Fitch was pleasant enough but had the quality of a man who was looking for a particular kind of woman, and when he found she was not precisely that, would look somewhere else. She said he wants an ornament, Cal said with a grin. Her word, ornament. Stephen said nothing, but he walked home that evening with something lighter in his chest. The following Saturday he arrived at the Turner property to find Letitia on a ladder again, this time much more carefully positioned, working on the chimney flashing. He stood below and steadied the ladder without comment, and she came down and they stood in the cool October morning, and she looked at him in a way that was different from before, more open, as if something had been decided. Gerald Fitch left for San Antonio yesterday, she said. I heard, he said. He was very kind, she said, but he was looking for something I am not. What is that? Someone who wants to be looked after, she said. I want to be, she thought for a moment. I want to be alongside someone, not managed. He looked at her in the clear October light. "I think you are one of the least manageable people I have ever met," he said. And this time the smile came full and free, not the small, careful one she kept banked, but a real smile that changed her whole face. And it was so unexpectedly beautiful that Stephen Sullivan, who had spent 4 years building walls, felt every last one of them shudder at the foundation. "Stephen," she said. "Letitia," he said, and her name in his mouth felt like something he should have been saying for a long time. "I think," she began, and then stopped and started again with the precision she always brought to important things. "I think you are a good man. I think you have been hiding it behind a fence line for a while, but it is very evident. And I think," another pause, "I think I would like to know more of you if you are willing." "I am willing," he said. The words came out with a simplicity and directness that surprised him, because they were true and unguarded and he had not planned them. She reached out and briefly, lightly, touched his hand where it rested on the fence rail just a moment, and then she withdrew it, but the warmth of it stayed. "Good," she said. "Then come for supper Sunday. I will make something proper." He came for supper Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the Sunday after that. In November, Daniel fell ill. It was a croup, the kind that comes down fast in children when the weather turns cold and damp. And Letitia was up 3 nights running with the boy, sitting with him in the steam of the kettle, and keeping his fever down with cold cloths. And Stephen found out on the second morning because she did not appear at her fence for the morning chores, and he went to look in concern. She came to the door when he knocked, and she had been up all night and looked it, but she would not leave Daniel to go to the door, and so she called Daniel's name to let him know she would be back. And she stood in the doorway with dark circles under her eyes and her hair loose, and told Stephen that Daniel was sick, but she had it under control. "I will fetch Dr. Hale," Stephen said. "I cannot," she began. "I am not asking you to afford it right now," he said. "I will sort that out later. He needs to be seen by the doctor." She looked at him, and he could see the struggle between the pride that had kept her upright through 2 hard years and the exhaustion and fear that wanted to let someone else carry something for a moment. "Please," he said simply. Her shoulders dropped slightly, not in defeat but in the particular relief of a person who has been holding something very heavy and has been offered a place to set it down. "Thank you," she said quietly. He fetched Dr. Hale, who came and examined Daniel and confirmed it was croup rather than anything more serious, and gave Letitia a supply of the appropriate medicines and specific instructions that she followed exactly and competently. And by the 4th day, Daniel was improving, eating soft foods and demanding that someone bring him his books, which Stephen took as a very good sign. On the evening of the 4th day, Stephen sat in the small chair beside Daniel's bed and read aloud from Daniel's copy of a travel book about the American West that some kind soul had given the boy in Abilene. It was somewhat ironic, reading about the West while sitting in it, but Daniel listened with great attention and fell asleep in the middle of a description of the Rocky Mountains. Stephen came out of the room and found Letitia at the kitchen table with her head resting on her folded arms, not asleep, just resting, and she straightened when he came in. "He is asleep," Stephen said quietly. "He is going to be all right." She pressed her lips together and nodded. He could see the emotion moving through her that she was not going to let out. The particular contained grief and relief of a mother who has spent 4 days being afraid, and will not indulge the fear now that the immediate danger is past. He sat down across from her at the table. He did not say anything. He just sat, present, in the way of a person who understands that sometimes what is needed is not words or solutions, but simply the fact of company. After a long moment, she said, in a voice that was quiet and a little unsteady, "He is all I have left of the life before." "I know," Stephen said. "Sometimes I am so afraid of not being enough for him," she said. "Of not being able to give him what he needs." "You are enough," Stephen said, with the certainty of a man who has been watching this woman work for 6 months. "You are more than enough. He is a remarkable boy, and he is remarkable because of you." She looked at him across the table, and her eyes were bright with the tears she was not shedding, and something in her face was open in a way he had not seen before, the particular openness of a person who has been seen clearly by someone else for the first time in a long time. "Stephen," she said, and his name in her mouth had a weight to it now. "Yes," he said. "I think I am falling in love with you," she said, with the same plain courage she brought to everything, looking him directly in the eye, no decoration, no performance. The words moved through him like the first warm wind of spring after a long winter, reaching places that had been cold so long they had forgotten what warmth was. "I know I am falling in love with you," he said. "I have been trying not to on account of being a fool, but there it is." A tear escaped, finally, just one, and she brushed it away with the back of her hand with a small sound that might have been a laugh. "We are quite a pair," she said. "We are," he agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand in his, and she let him hold it, and they sat like that in the quiet kitchen while the fire burned low and Daniel slept soundly in the next room. And Stephen Sullivan felt the wall he had been building for 4 years come down completely and quietly, not all at once in a dramatic crash, but in the particular gentle way of a thing that has finally decided it is no longer necessary. The winter of 1883 going into 1884 was cold but not brutal, and Stephen and Letitia moved forward in the careful, sure way of two people who have been hurt before and are making something real. He courted her properly, which in Calhoun Creek in 1883 meant coming to the door with his hat in his hand, meant being seen together at church on Sundays, meant long evenings at her kitchen table while Daniel did his schoolwork, and the gradual weaving together of two lives that had been running parallel and were now beginning to run as one. Mrs. Hargrove was thrilled because she had decided, in retrospect, that the whole thing had been her idea, and nobody corrected her on this because it was not worth the energy. Cal Rourke was quietly and enormously pleased in the way of a man whose advice had been vindicated, and he expressed this mainly by not saying "I told you so" more than 3 times. Stephen did say "I told you so" to the chestnut mare, who had been making steady progress, and who now came to the fence rail when he appeared in the morning, and who had begun, in the last few weeks, to take feed from his hand without flinching. He told her that sometimes the things that frighten you are exactly the things worth going toward, and the mare flicked her ear at him, and he took that as agreement. It was a Sunday in late February, after church, and Letitia and Daniel had come for supper at Stephen's place for the first time. Letitia had made pie from preserved apples she had put up in the fall, and they sat at Stephen's table, which was larger than hers, and had the additional virtue of a view out the south window toward the sweep of the open range, and Daniel ate 3 pieces of pie and then fell asleep on the settee in the front room, and Stephen and Letitia sat at the table with the remnants of supper around them and the fire going good in the hearth. "I want to ask you something," Stephen said. She looked at him steadily. She always looked at him steadily, and he loved this about her, that she never flinched or looked away when he was serious. She just met it. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I am saying it plainly because you have never liked things wrapped up. You said you want to be alongside someone, not managed, and I understand that. I am not asking to manage anything about you or your land or Daniel or any of it. I am asking to be alongside you, in every way, for all of it." The fire snapped in the hearth. Outside, the prairie wind moved over the grass. In the next room, Daniel made a small sound in his sleep. Letitia Turner looked at Stephen Sullivan across his kitchen table with the full weight of her clear brown eyes and the full strength of the woman she had built herself into through 2 years of grief and work and solitary courage, and she said, "Yes." Not yes with qualifications, not yes but just yes, simple and whole and absolute, and it was the most beautiful word Stephen Sullivan had ever heard. He exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for a very long time. "Then yes," he said, somewhat redundantly, and she laughed, and the laugh was so bright and free that Daniel stirred in the next room, and Stephen reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat together in the warmth of the fire and made plans. The wedding was in April, on a Saturday when the bluebonnets were just starting to come in along the creek, and the sky was the particular clear blue that Texas does in spring, like it is making up for every difficulty of every other season. Reverend Mills presided, and the whole of Calhoun Creek seemed to have come, which was both gratifying and slightly overwhelming, and Cal Rourke stood up with Stephen, and Mrs. Caldwell stood with Letitia, because they had formed a friendship over the winter that was the unlikely and genuine result of Mrs. Caldwell being the first person in Calhoun Creek to extend Letitia credit without making her feel small for needing it. Daniel stood between his mother and Stephen during the ceremony with an expression of solemn importance, and at one point he reached up and took Stephen's hand as naturally as breathing, and Stephen felt it in the center of his chest and held on carefully. Letitia wore the green dress from the August dance, which was the best dress she had, and she had added a length of white lace at the collar that she had made herself, and she carried a small bunch of bluebonnets that Daniel had picked that morning from along the creek. She was the most beautiful thing Stephen had ever seen, not in the manufactured way of beauty for display, but in the particular beauty of a person being fully and completely themselves. When Reverend Mills said they were married, and Stephen kissed his wife for the first time with the whole town watching, he heard Cal let out a sound behind him that was almost certainly a happy sob, and he would never let Cal live that down. They went home, which was now Stephen's house, which was now their house, and Letitia's property next door would be worked together with the ranch in a way they had already planned in detail over the kitchen table over several winter evenings, with Daniel contributing thoughts about where the new vegetable garden should go. And that evening, after Daniel had been put to bed with the great solemnity of a boy who knows something important has changed, but is not entirely sure what all of it means yet, Stephen and Letitia sat on the porch in the April dark and listened to the night sounds of their land. "Are you frightened?" he asked her. She considered this honestly, as she considered everything. "No," she said. "I have been frightened before, and I know what it feels like. This is not that. This is," she searched for the word, "this is solid." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what it is." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of their house on their land in Calhoun Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1884, and listened to the world go on around them. The first years of their marriage were good years, and not without their difficulties, because good years and difficulties are not mutually exclusive, and anyone who has ever actually lived knows this. The summer of 1884 was dry, and the kitchen garden struggled, and two of Stephen's horses came down with an illness that took one before Dr. Brennan out of Fort Worth, who Stephen had brought in at considerable expense, was able to identify and treat the other. They sat up 3 nights together with the sick horse, Letitia bringing coffee and taking turns with Stephen so he could rest. And when the horse pulled through on the 4th morning, they stood in the barn in the early light with the exhaustion and relief of it. And Letitia put her arms around Stephen and he held her, and they did not need to say anything. Daniel started school in Calhoun Creek that fall, and it emerged over the first weeks that he was, in the words of his teacher, Miss Prewitt, the most reading-advanced child she had encountered in her 12 years of teaching in Texas. This was gratifying and also somewhat problematic, because Daniel read through every book in the school's modest library by November and began quietly importing books from Mrs. Caldwell's store on a credit arrangement that Stephen and Letitia were perfectly happy to honor. The boy wanted knowledge the way some people want water, and they did not intend to thirst him. Stephen adopted Daniel legally, with Daniel's full understanding and agreement, in the fall of 1884. The paperwork involved a trip to the county seat and a quantity of bureaucratic machinery that tried Stephen's patience but not his resolve. And when it was done, Daniel Sullivan stood in the kitchen of their house and shook Stephen's hand with 7-year-old seriousness, and then accepted a hug with 7-year-old dignity, and then went outside and ran around the yard whooping in a way that suggested the dignity had been mostly for show. Letitia watched from the kitchen window, and she turned to Stephen and kissed him on the cheek and said simply, "Thank you." He shook his head because no thanks were needed, because Daniel was the most interesting small person he had encountered, and he would not have done it differently. In early 1885, there was trouble with a man named Vance Dillard. Dillard was a land speculator who had come through the county buying up smaller properties, and he had his eye on the piece of land between Stevens Ranch and what had been the Turner property, a strip of good grazing land along the creek that had been common range for years, but which Dillard now claimed to have a legal interest in based on a title he had purchased, of unclear provenance, from a man in Austin. This was a concern not only for Stephen and Letitia, but for 3 other small landowners nearby, and it led to a series of tense meetings in the Calhoun Creek Sheriff's office with Dale Morrow, who was thorough and fair, and ultimately to a correspondence with a land attorney in Fort Worth named James Kellogg that cost a considerable amount but was unambiguously necessary. Stephen handled the legal side of things with the steady, methodical approach he brought to most problems, and Letitia proved invaluable in the correspondence, because she wrote clearly and precisely, and had the particular gift of articulating a complex situation in terms that made the logic undeniable. Her letters to Kellogg laid out the timeline of land use and the inconsistencies in Dillard's claimed title in a way that Kellogg later told them was the most useful initial brief he had received from a non-lawyer client. The matter was resolved in the summer of 1885, when Kellogg's investigation revealed that Dillard's title was based on a fraudulent survey, and the local courts found accordingly. Dillard left Calhoun Creek with the particular speed of a man who has recognized that he has miscalculated his opposition. After the final ruling came in, Stephen and Letitia stood at the creek that evening, the disputed creek, with the summer water moving quietly over the stones, and Letitia put her hand in his and said, "This is ours," not in a grasping way but in the way of something finally certain. "This is ours," he agreed. He looked at her in the summer evening light, this woman who had come down a dusty trail with a wagon and a child and the absolute undefeated intention of making a life, and he thought about the man he had been 4 years ago driving fence posts into the ground and telling himself the quiet was better, and he was so profoundly glad to have been wrong. "I love you," he said. He said it often now because he had understood in these 2 years of marriage that love said aloud is not a vulnerability. It is a daily act of commitment, and he committed to it every day. She turned to him and there was everything in her face, the strength and the warmth and the clear-eyed, full-hearted courage of the woman she was. "I love you," she said. "Now let's go home, because Daniel is going to burn supper if we leave him at the stove any longer." He laughed and they walked home along the creek in the summer evening, her hand in his. In the fall of 1885, Letitia told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning over coffee, with the same directness she brought to everything, watching his face for his response. He sat very still for a moment, and then he set down his cup and reached across the table and took her face in both hands and looked at her for a long, full moment, and then he kissed her forehead and her cheek and said against her hair, "Are you well? Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said, smiling against his shoulder. "I am happy." "I am," he stopped, because the feeling was so large that ordinary words felt inadequate to it. "I am very, very happy," he said, and she laughed and so did he, and Daniel looked in from the doorway where he had come for breakfast and looked between them and said, with the perception of a child who misses very little, "Something has happened." They told him. He sat with it for approximately 4 seconds and then said, "Will it be a brother?" with such transparent hopefulness that Letitia covered her mouth with her hand and Stephen made a sound that was mostly a laugh. "We do not know," Stephen told him. "Either would be a good thing." Daniel considered this, apparently performed some internal calculation, and then nodded. "All right," he said, with the magnanimity of a young man making a concession, and went to get his breakfast. Letitia's pregnancy was not easy in the early months. She had sickness in the mornings that was worse than she let on, and Stephen, who paid attention, knew it was worse than she let on, and was quietly and thoroughly present without making a production of it. He got up earlier to manage the heavier morning chores. He brought food to her before she had to come to the kitchen. He learned over these weeks what helped and what did not, and he applied this knowledge with the same methodical care he applied to his horses. "You do not have to fuss," she said one morning, sitting on the porch in the cold fall air because the fresh cold helped. "I know I do not have to," he said, sitting beside her. "Then why do you?" He looked at her. "Because you spent 2 years doing everything alone because you had to. You do not have to anymore." She looked at him for a long moment with something so warm and full in her eyes that it made the cold morning feel like summer. "No," she said softly, "I do not." She was better by December, and the winter passed in the particular warmth of a well-kept house with a good fire and people who love each other inside it. Daniel read his books. Stephen worked on plans for expanding the horse barn in the spring. Letitia sewed and wrote letters and sat in the evenings with her feet up at her husband's insistence, which she tolerated with good grace most of the time and with light complaints the rest. Her old friend from Abilene, a woman named Frances, who had known Letitia in her widowhood and had been the one to encourage her to come to Calhoun Creek in the first place, wrote to ask how she was getting on, and Letitia's reply was one of the happiest letters she had ever written. Frances wrote back that she was delighted and also thoroughly unsurprised, because she had known from the moment Letitia described her neighbor over Christmas that something would come of it. And Letitia told Stephen this, and he shook his head with the expression of a man who discovers that the people around him have been several steps ahead of him for quite some time. The baby came in late May of 1886, which was fitting, because May in Texas is the month the world looks most like a promise kept. It was a boy, and they named him James Robert Sullivan, James for Stephen's father and Robert for Letitia's late husband, because Letitia believed that honoring Robert's place in Daniel's history was the right thing to do, and Stephen agreed with her completely, because he was the kind of man who understood that love does not require the erasure of what came before. James Robert Sullivan arrived in the world with considerable noise and strong opinions, and a full head of dark hair like his father's, and Daniel stood in the doorway of the bedroom afterward, with an expression of profound awe mixed with something very close to panic, and Stephen brought him in to sit on the bed beside his mother and meet his brother, and Daniel held the baby with the careful, terrified intensity of a boy holding something that matters more than he has words for, and looked up and said, "He is very small." "He was smaller a few hours ago," Letitia said, with the amused, exhausted serenity of a woman who has just done something enormous and knows it. "He will get bigger," Stephen said. "You did." Daniel looked at the baby and something settled in his face, some decision. "Hello, James," he said quietly with dignity, and the baby made a small sound and Daniel looked up with the gap-toothed grin that still appeared completely suddenly and changed everything. "He heard me," he said. "He did," Letitia said. Stephen stood in the doorway of the bedroom of his house on his land in Calhoun Creek, Texas, in May of 1886, and watched his wife hold their son while their other son, because Daniel was fully his in every way that counted, sat close beside her, and the feeling that moved through him was so complete and so full that it left no room for anything else. Not old heartbreak, not old fear, not the careful distance of a man who has decided he is safer alone. He had been wrong about being safer alone, and he had never been more glad of anything. Cal Rourke visited 2 days later with his wife Bridget and a pot of soup and the completely unwarranted pride of a man who believes he has personally caused a baby to exist through the sheer force of good advice, and Stephen shook his hand and said, "You were right." Cal's eyebrows went up. "Can I have that in writing?" "Absolutely not," Stephen said. Cal laughed and came inside. The years after that were years of substance and growth, the kind that accumulate without drama in the daily reality of two people building a life together. The horse ranch expanded. Stephen's reputation for sound, well-trained horses spread through South Texas, and by 1888 he was supplying regularly to 3 different army posts and had more private buyers than he could easily serve, which was a good problem to have. He hired a hand, a young Mexican man named Aurelio whose family had been in Texas since before it was Texas and who understood horses with the instinctive fluency of someone raised with them. Aurelio and Daniel developed a friendship that was primarily conducted through horses and the occasional fishing trip to the creek, and which taught Daniel things about horsemanship and about the long, complicated history of this land that no classroom in Calhoun Creek was offering. It is worth noting, because it is true and it mattered, that the situation Aurelio and his family occupied was not without its difficulties in the Texas of the 1880s, where the law and the land and the old grievances moved in complicated ways around the people who had been there longest. Stephen employed Aurelio at fair wages and treated him as the skilled man he was, and Letitia made sure he was fed at their table on the evenings he worked late, and they could not fix every injustice of the world they lived in, but they could be decent within the world they occupied, and they were. The Turner land, which was formally merged with the Sullivan Ranch by 1887, but which Letitia always called her land with an affection and a particular proprietary softness, produced a kitchen garden that was the envy of the county, and in 1888 Letitia began selling preserves and dried herbs to Mrs. Caldwell's store on a formal arrangement, and this became another thread in the fabric of their livelihood. She was also, by this time, on the school board, having been invited by Miss Pruitt, who recognized in Letitia a woman with strong opinions about education and the good sense to suggest she put those opinions to use in an official capacity. Daniel, at 12, was reading philosophy. Stephen came home one afternoon to find him in deep conversation with Aurelio about the nature of land ownership, and stood in the barn door listening for a few minutes before either of them noticed him, and thought, "This boy is going to be something remarkable." In 1889, Letitia told him she was expecting again. She told him in the same morning over coffee way she had told him about James, watching his face with that clear, measuring look. This time he did not sit still at all. He stood up and came around the table and lifted her out of her chair and held her, and she laughed against his shoulder with a fullness that was different from the careful, banked warmth of the woman who had first driven that wagon down the trail 6 years ago. James, who was 3.5 and had developed enormous opinions about everything, demanded to know what was happening, and they told him, and he said, "I want a dog more," which Letitia said was Daniel's influence, and Daniel, who was 12 and had recently decided he was too old to be obvious about his feelings, produced a grin that gave him away entirely. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1890, and they named her Eleanor Grace Sullivan. Eleanor for the grace of something new, and Grace because Letitia said the word felt right, and Stephen said any name she liked felt right to him, and this was exactly the kind of husband he had become. Eleanor Grace arrived with her mother's brown eyes and her father's dark hair, and the absolute conviction of a girl who knows she has arrived somewhere important. Daniel, who was 14 and had long since graduated to a dignity that only occasionally slipped, held her with the same careful awe he had held James, and James at 3 stood on his toes to look and said, "She is smaller than I was," with great authority, which was almost certainly not based in fact. They had 5 of the best years that followed, years of plenty and of work, and of the ordinary extraordinary richness of a family that knows it is a family, of evenings on the porch with the children and the stars, and the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something that matters. Stephen looked at his wife one evening in the fall of 1890, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the children in bed, going over the ranch accounts in the way they did every month together, and he felt the full sum of it, the years, the work, the love that had grown not smaller but larger with time, the way real things do. "What?" she said, looking up from the ledger and catching him looking. "Nothing," he said, and then, "everything." She looked at him with those clear brown eyes that had never lost their sharpness or their warmth, and she said, "Come help me with these numbers, then, and tell me everything while you do it." He did. By 1891, Daniel was 15 and had determined that he wanted to study law. This came as a surprise to nobody who had been watching him argue points of fairness at the kitchen table for the last 5 years, and least of all to Stephen, who had been quietly and deliberately setting aside money for the boy's education since the adoption, against the day when Daniel's mind outgrew what Calhoun Creek could offer. They talked about it one evening, the three of them, Daniel, Letitia, and Stephen, at the kitchen table, the way they talked about important things in their family, which was directly and with everyone's full attention. "There is a preparatory school in Fort Worth," Daniel said. He had researched this with the thoroughness he brought to everything. Then a law college after. It would mean leaving Calhoun Creek. He looked between his parents with something careful and searching in his face, the old watchfulness of a boy who had learned young that circumstances change. "We know," Letitia said. "You have always been going somewhere," Stephen said. "That has never been a surprise. The question is only the shape of the road." "You saved money," Daniel said. It was not a question. He had figured it out. "For this." "For whatever you needed," Stephen said. Daniel looked at him for a moment with something in his face that had no adequate word: gratitude and love and the complex recognition of all that had been given. Not only the money, but all of it. The years of Saturday mornings and horses and suppers, and the particular uncomplicated commitment of a man who chose this boy and kept choosing him. "I will come back," Daniel said. "When I have finished, I want to come back here." "I know," Stephen said. "This is home." Daniel came around the table and, with the seriousness of 15, shook Stephen's hand. Stephen gripped it and held it, and they looked at each other. And then Stephen pulled the boy into a hug that Daniel accepted and returned with the fervor that lives beneath all the dignity of adolescent boys. And Letitia sat at the kitchen table with her hand over her mouth, and something bright in her eyes that she was absolutely not going to call crying. James, who was 5 and had been listening from the doorway, chose this moment to announce that he was also going to leave and go find a dog, and the moment broke apart into laughter that filled the kitchen. Daniel left for Fort Worth in the summer of 1892, and the house was quieter without him, and full regardless, because James was 6 and Alina Grace was 2, and they together constituted more noise and motion than seemed physically possible from such small people. The town of Calhoun Creek had grown around them through these years. A second church, a proper hotel, a telegraph office, a small newspaper that the editor, a young man from Ohio, ran with enormous enthusiasm and variable quality. The wild country of the 1870s had softened at the edges, had become something more than it was and less lonely, though the land itself was unchanged, still the same vast, patient, beautiful land that had drawn people west since the beginning. Stephen was 41 years old in 1895, and he felt it in his back after a long day of fence work, but not in anything else. And when Letitia teased him about it, he pointed out that she was 39 and showed no signs of slowing down either, which she took as a compliment because it was one. Daniel wrote letters from Fort Worth with the regularity of a boy who had been raised by a woman who believed in correspondence. And the letters were full of the law and the philosophy and the social questions of the day, and the particular energy of a young man discovering the full scope of his own intelligence. And they read them aloud at the supper table and discussed them. And James at 9 listened with wide eyes, and Alina Grace at 5 absorbed it all with the quiet intentness of a child who is filing everything away for later use. Cal Rourke had, over the years, become as much family as friend, coming to Sunday suppers with Bridget and their 3 children, and contributing his particular brand of cheerful pragmatism to the general texture of their lives. He still claimed, occasionally, that the whole business of Stephen and Letitia had been his idea, and Letitia always said that she supposed he was entitled to his version of history, and Stephen always said that she was more generous than he deserved, and Cal always said, "I told you so, Sullivan, in April of 1883, and I was right, and no amount of revisionism changes that." He was right, and they all knew it, and they would none of them say so. In 1897, Daniel came home. He came back to Calhoun Creek in the summer, having completed his law studies, 21 years old and full of everything he had learned, and he stepped off the stage into the main street of the town where he had grown up and looked around with the particular expression of a person seeing a familiar place through changed eyes. Stephen and Letitia were waiting with James and a leaner Grace, and Daniel dropped his bag in the dust and hugged his mother for a long time, and then shook Stephen's hand, and this time Stephen saw the man his son had become, and it moved him in a way he would have found difficult to describe. Daniel established a law practice in Calhoun Creek the following year, and the town received it with the enthusiasm they reserved for their own people who come back having done something worth coming back for. He was good at the work, patient and rigorous, and with an instinct for fairness that had been in him since he was 7 years old, standing at a corral fence watching a frightened mare. James, at 12, had determined that he wanted to be a rancher and had been saying so with increasing specificity for 3 years. And Stephen had been training him in the particular way of a man who takes such a declaration seriously, not as a childhood fancy, but as a genuine statement of direction. James had his mother's practical intelligence and his father's ease with animals, and he had been working real hours on the ranch since he was 10, and Stephen watched him with the boy's growing skill and quiet pride. A leaner Grace, at 8, had decided she wanted to be a doctor, and she announced this at the supper table with a definiteness that stopped the conversation entirely. Stephen looked at Letitia. Letitia looked at Stephen. Then Letitia said, "Then we had better make sure you are the best student in Miss Prewitt's class." And a leaner Grace said, "I already am," with a certainty that was, as a matter of verifiable fact, entirely accurate. The years had a good shape to them, round and full like good years do. There was an evening in the late summer of 1898 when Stephen and Letitia sat on the porch as they had sat on evenings for 15 years, and the stars came out over the Texas dark one by one, and the horses shifted in the corral, and from inside the house they could hear the low voices of Daniel and James talking, and a leaner Grace's occasional interjection, sharp and certain as a bell. "Do you remember," Letitia said, "the first night you fixed my window?" "I remember," he said. "You handed me back your coffee cup," she said, "and I thought, that is a man who was raised right." He smiled. "High praise." "It was," she said seriously, though her eyes were warm with the humor she had always kept carefully tended beside the seriousness. "I thought, there is a man who does not need the credit for the cup, he just hands it back." "I had very little else to recommend me at that point," he said. She shook her head. "You had everything," she said. "You just could not see it yet." He looked at her in the soft dark. This woman who had driven a wagon down a trail and fixed a wheel fitting outside of Abilene and made a life from nothing but her own will and her good clear vision of what mattered, who had taken his hand across a kitchen table and said yes in the plainest and most complete way, who had made him a father and a husband and made him understand, slowly and patiently, and with great clarity, that love is not a wall you build against the world but a door you open. "I see it now," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of their house in Calhoun Creek, Texas, in the last good light of a summer evening, with their children's voices inside and their land around them and all of it, every last impossible beautiful thing of it, solid and certain and real. Out in the corral, the chestnut mare that had been afraid moved quietly in the warm dark. She had been the best horse on the ranch for 12 years, trusted and willing and steady, and she had a filly this spring that was coming along fine. Stephen had named the mare Faith, which had seemed right at the time and seemed more right every year. Somewhere in the house, James said something and Daniel laughed, and a leaner Grace said something quick and precise that made both of them groan, and Letitia said against Stephen's shoulder very softly, "Listen to them." "I am listening," he said. "Good," she said. "So am I." They stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out and the air had the cool edge that comes down off the range on late summer nights. And when they went inside, the house was warm and full of light, and the children were around the kitchen table in various stages of conversation and argument. And Letitia put water on for coffee, and Stephen sat at the table with his family, and the door was open, and the night was good. Daniel stayed in Calhoun Creek and built a practice that served the small landowners and the ordinary people of the county with the fairness and skill that had always been in him. He married a woman named Alice Brennan in 1900, a schoolteacher with a quick mind and a dry humor that complemented his own, and they had 3 children. And Stephen and Letitia were grandparents in a way that delighted and slightly astonished them both. And the table on Sundays got larger and louder and more wonderful. James took over the primary management of the horse ranch by 1903, at 18, when Stephen began to step back from the heaviest work, and he ran it with such natural authority and good sense that the transition was nearly seamless. And Aurelio, who was still there, said that James had his father's eye for a horse and his mother's stubbornness, by which he meant 2 good things. Eleanor Grace studied medicine, eventually, after a series of careful and persistent negotiations, with the realities of what was available to women in medicine in Texas at the turn of the century, and she became a doctor's assistant in Fort Worth, and then, by 1910, one of the few women in the state with a full medical practice. And she wrote long letters home that were full of the work and the injustice of it and the satisfaction of it, and the sheer stubborn insistence of a woman who had decided what she was going to do and done it. Letitia read these letters with enormous pride and a recognition, in her daughter, of something that was also herself. The world had changed around Calhoun Creek, the way the world does the telegraph, the railroad that came through in 1895 and made everything faster and closer, the automobile that appeared on the main street of town in 1908 and caused a sensation. But the land was still the land, and the house was still the house, and in the evenings Stephen and Letitia still sat on the porch when the weather was good and watched the stars come out. In the spring of 1910, Stephen Sullivan sat on the porch of his house in the warm late afternoon, watching a hawk ride the thermals above the open range. He was 55 years old. His hair had gone silver at the temples and his hands had the map of work on them, and his back gave him its thoughts on long days, but his eyes were still green and still, as his mother had once said, kind. Letitia came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to him and sat in the chair beside him, and she was 53 and as clear-eyed and straight-backed as she had ever been, with threads of silver in her chestnut hair and the particular beauty of a woman who has been fully alive for 53 years, and it shows in the best possible way. "Daniel is bringing Alice and the children for Sunday," she said. "I know. James says the new filly is ready to work." "She is." "Eleanor Grace is coming in August." "I know," he looked at her. "You are making a list." "I am taking stock," she said with that small private smile. "There is a difference." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and the hawk wheeled above the open range, and the afternoon light came in long and gold over the prairie, and he thought about a young man driving a fence post into the hard ground, and deciding he was done with love forever, and he thought about a wagon coming down a trail with a woman sitting straight-backed on the seat with the reins competently in both hands, and he thought about all the distance between that afternoon and this one, and how it had been covered not in one great stride but in 1,000 small ones, each one the choice to open the door instead of close it. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. "Stephen," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad I moved next door," she said. He looked at her, this woman who was his great good fortune, the best thing that had ever happened to a man who had once decided that nothing good was going to happen to him again, and he felt the full weight and the full sweetness of it, all of it, every year, every morning, every evening on this porch, every hand held across every kitchen table. Every child raised, and every horse trained, and every fence post, and every shutter fixed, and every dance, and every cup of coffee, and every single word of every single conversation they had ever had, and all the ones still to come. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The hawk climbed higher on the warm air, and the afternoon stretched long and golden over their land, and somewhere in the house a door opened, and the sound of their family moved through it into the good, bright day.